This is Mehwish, a research associate at South Asia Research Institute for Minorities. You are watching with me an exclusive interviews by SARIM. I'm very glad to introduce our today's special guest. He became involved in anti-poverty organizing in the early 1980s, shortly after he immigrated to Canada from UK. When he helped to the former union unemployed worker in London and Ontario. In 1990, he moved to the Toronto to become an organizer with the newly formed Ontario Coalition Against Poverty. He remains in this role for a long time, directly involved in campaign and initiative to challenge poverty, homelessness, and political agenda of austerity that has led to the intensification of these problems. He is presently the faculty visitor in social justice at Toronto York University. In that capacity, he teaches courses in social movement, struggle at the university, and is presently helping to develop a course that can assist the social justice struggles for people of radicalized communities. Mr. John Clarke, welcome to SARIM. So let's get started our session. Mr. John, being an advocate of poverty alleviations, what kind of drive or initiative you has been engaged with? And do you always wanted to go for an advocacy role to the support of unprivileged communities?
Yeah, well, I suppose to take it in reverse order, I myself in my own life came from a family that had been affected by poverty in London, England, where I grew up, and I suppose that significantly affected the way I viewed the question. I early in life, when I was working, I joined trade unions and I was active in trade union struggles. I emigrated to Canada, and then I found myself in a situation of being an unemployed worker myself. And so that sort of prompted me to, that drove me to become involved in anti-poverty struggles and to try to help form a union of unemployed workers in the town of London, Ontario, where I was living at that time. The kind of struggles that I've been involved in have been one in which we have tried to organize people affected by poverty and unemployment and homelessness and create some level of political power. And so we've tried to use methods of collective action, protests, demonstrations, direct actions, various ways in which people who are, it would seem, have little to bargain with, who have little power, can, through their own collective action, create some level of counter power. The US-based writers Francis Fox Piven and Richard A. Cloud wrote a book that was called Poor People's Movements. And they put forward the proposition that the main way in which the poor can have political influence is through their ability to create crises by disrupting institutions. So if you look at all the movements of poor people historically and in a contemporary setting that have made major gains, it's been based on that kind of mobilization. And so that's what we tried to do in the various, particularly with the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, was in the context of a mounting agenda of austerity and social abandonment, with levels of poverty increasing, with a homeless problem in the incredibly wealthy city of Toronto spinning out of control. We tried to organize in ways that could actually give people some ability to obtain concessions. And that was the kind of mobilizing that we did. We organized homeless encampments to make homelessness something that was visible in this wealthy city. We organized protest movements by poor people, and we tried to create a situation where the poor demonstrated that if they were going to be abandoned, they were also going to become a problem for the people in power. And that was really the basis on which we tried to organize.
That's quite interesting. I would like to know further that who and what has been your inspiration, and also I'm very curious to know that how you started your career and what are your future aims.
Yeah, well, I mean, the kind of models that exist of unemployed organizing and anti-poverty organizing, we can draw from all kinds of different examples. Historically, at least in the what I'll call the wealthy countries, during the Great Depression, the movements of the unemployed in the 1930s are probably the great inspiration. There was a large mobilization in Britain, in Canada, in the United States, of people in the context of the Great Depression. At that time, there were no real social programs in place. And if people faced unemployment, they faced literal starvation and destitution. And so people organized very urgently in those contexts to try to win redress. In Britain, there were the great hunger marches, where people mobilized in huge numbers and marched across the country, demanding relief, demanding measures of social provision. There were similar mobilizations here in Canada. In 1935, there was a huge demonstration that became known as the On to Ottawa Trek, where people who had been young men who had been forced into labor camps run under military authority, left the camps, organized a strike, and rode across the country on the top of freight trains to go to Ottawa and demand relief. But those kinds of actions, I mean, we know of the big ones that passed into history and become famous, but those kinds of mobilizations took place every day. People organized to get what they needed to survive from the authorities. So people organized in very big numbers to prevent people being evicted from their homes. On one particular occasion in Etobicoke, which is a western suburb of Toronto, there was a mobilization of women that challenged the fact that people's water supply was being cut off when they couldn't pay their water bills. And so 2,000 women organized to go to the home of the head of the Public Utilities Commission. They walked through his front door with buckets and started filling up their buckets at his kitchen sink and his bathtub. And that sort of defiant action led to a situation where those families were given their water supply. The most basic and important necessity. And all through the world today, we see various forms of people organizing in the face of poverty and abandonment, and challenging that kind of an agenda. So I tried in the work that I did with the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty to contribute as an organizer to building that capacity within communities that were facing social abandonment. At this stage of the game, I've now stepped down. I'm later in life, and I'm more trying to contribute to teaching, to writing, to putting forward ideas that will be useful to the people that come after me. But I do think, in the context of the pandemic and such like, that we're facing not an improved situation, but actually a very much worsened situation. And the need for the kind of model of organizing that I'm talking about is actually going to be greater than it's ever been before.
It's very impressive and interesting story behind your struggle. So while you're working on the various aspects of human rights, so what sort of the challenge have you faced so far, and what made you to withstand the challenge and to adhere to the work for the human support and assistance?
Right. Well, in the context of Canada, questions of poverty and unemployment and homelessness are also, at a very fundamental level, human rights questions. Canada as a country was established by dispossessing the indigenous people that lived here before there was a Canada. And that was a very brutal, indeed a genocidal undertaking. So whole nations of people were destroyed and eliminated. People were dispossessed in order to create the Canadian state. Indigenous people were dispossessed, and that continues to play out in terms of the treatment of Indigenous people in Canada, and it interrelates with questions of poverty to an enormous degree. the Indigenous population of Canada makes up about 5% of the population, and yet 30% of the people who are locked away in prisons are Indigenous. In the city I live in, Toronto, about 2% of the population consists of Indigenous people, but 33% of the people who are homeless and sleep on the streets are Indigenous people. So there is an enormous level of injustice and abandonment and a denial of the rights of Indigenous people, their rights as nations and their rights as human beings, that is so deeply ingrained in Canadian society that it's very much part of the issue. The whole strategy has been on the part of the Canadian state to try to destroy Indigenous identity. In the 19th century and throughout large part of the 20th century, Indigenous children were taken from their homes and put into residential schools where they died in very large numbers in an attempt to crush their identity, to destroy their culture, to destroy their languages. Indigenous children have repeatedly been taken away from their families and put up for adoption as another kind of a strategy to destroy their identity. And today the rates of incarceration have turned prisons into the new residential schools. So that remains a fundamental question within addressing poverty within Canadian society, and also a broader racism. Immigrant populations, populations of people who don't come from European countries especially, face very, very high levels of poverty and pervasive racism. So that too is very much part of the situation in terms of levels of poverty, levels of unemployment, access to services, representation within the prison population, the way people are policed. All these things are deeply interwoven. So you can't really address poverty in Canada without addressing racism and the enormous denial of human rights that is part of that. And that can be demonstrated clearly if you look at statistically the levels of poverty that are imposed on the various communities of people. This is a country where vaunts itself as an enlightened liberal democracy, and yet it is fundamentally and deeply racist. And anyone who tackles poverty becomes immediately aware of that. So that I think has been a very large part of the work we've done. And as we've tried to mobilize in communities, we've come across that in some of the struggles that we took up. For example, the Somali community played an enormously important role precisely because of the levels of poverty and abandonment that community faces. So that I think has been central to the work that I've been involved in.
Right. I think all human rights defenders, activists, and those people who are trying to help to others, they suffer with the lots of trouble. So how long have you been working with the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, and what is the vision of OCAP, and what accomplishment has the coalition made so far?
Right. Well, I stepped down a couple of years ago as an organizer with, I'll call it OCAP, and I was an organizer with OCAP for 28 years, and I was with the London Union of Unemployed Workers for 7 years before that. So a long time. And during that period, the kind of organizing that we did, I think it's necessary to acknowledge that we were organizing in a context of an increasing agenda of austerity and worsening poverty. So, I mean, if we'd have been organizing in the period of the 1960s, I think we might be able to point to the social programs that were put in place, the way in which poverty went down, and talk in terms of the contribution we made to that. Clearly, that was not the case. We were fighting a defensive struggle against an agenda that was getting worse. So in that sense, I can't say that I would have to acknowledge that things are worse today than when we started, right? There's no denying that. But we've been able to win some very significant victories in terms of the abandonment of people on the streets, homelessness, which is absolutely mind-boggling. I mean, Toronto is a city, I'm very conscious of the fact that I'm speaking to someone in Pakistan. And I'm speaking from a country that is a G7 country, a country of enormous wealth, a country where in this city, most of the world's mining capital is raised on the stock exchange. I mean, this is a country of incredible wealth. The super rich population within Toronto is the second highest anywhere in North America. This is a great center of wealth. And yet it's also a place of incredible levels of homelessness, which is a sickening contradiction. And we've organized to try to win shelter space for people. So in a period when the numbers of people going to the homeless shelters was skyrocketing and the number of people dying on the streets was skyrocketing, we organized a protest where we set up an encampment in a prominent city park. And it created for the people in power something of a crisis and forced significant concessions in terms of shelter space and such like. Many people who find themselves either by reason of sickness or disability or unemployment, find themselves without income, turn to a system of social assistance in this province that pays significantly below the poverty line. And in that situation, people are confronted with a choice between eating the nutritious diet they need and paying their rent. So people find themselves in a desperate situation. And we became aware of a benefit in 2005 that was called the special diet. And what it meant was that if you were on social assistance and a medical provider deemed it necessary, you could receive additional payment for food. And so what we did was we organized a huge campaign where we started getting sympathetic medical providers to come to clinics and sign people up for the special diet benefit. And then when the authorities tried to deny the benefits, we organized demonstrations and protests and occupations of offices and all sorts of things to actually win the benefit. And the Auditor General of Ontario said that the benefit had gone from one that was paying $6 million a year to one that was paying $200 million a year. So what I'm suggesting is that the kind of struggles we've taken up have been important in terms of actually making a tangible material difference in people's lives. But more than anything, I think our contribution has been in this period now of the pandemic and the crisis that comes out of the pandemic is we've contributed to providing a model of how people can resist, of how people can organize, of how people can make a difference. And I think in the situation we're in today, that's going to be at a premium. There's going to be a real need for people to mobilize effectively if they're not going to face outright social abandonment. So that, I think, is the greatest legacy of OCAP that's sort of on offer in the present period.
Well, you have been working tirelessly with this organization for the long time, and it's really commendable. So what kind of persecution and discrimination people are encountering in Canada, particularly minorities, and how your organization is serving to support and to the marginalized people for their struggle against the persecution?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that, in large measure, the persecution that people face on the basis of a denial of human rights, on the basis of racism, has been precisely the degree to which they find themselves abandoned to poverty. But there are other questions too, questions of how people are treated by the police. For example, people get shot and killed by the police in Toronto. Black people in this city are 20 times as likely to be shot and killed by a police officer as a white person. So those kinds of injustices are rampant. But there is also a growth of overt racism, right? There's also a growth of intolerance and persecution of people who are refugees. Linked to the war on terror, there has also been a huge growth in this country, and Canada's not unique in this regard, but there has been a huge growth of what is frequently referred to as Islamophobia, persecution of people based on their being Muslim. That is a rampant problem. Recently in London, Ontario, a man drove his car into a family based on the fact that he could identify them by their clothing as Muslim people, and killed most of the family. That's an extreme incident, but such things occur uh, all across the country all the time. People face threats, people face violence, people face abuse. So pushing back against that kind of assault on people's rights and people's dignity based on religious intolerance, based on racism, is absolutely a fundamental question. And I think to some degree we can challenge it by speaking out, we can challenge it by education, but more than anything I think we have to have a movement of people, a movement of people that leaves no one behind, a movement of people that is ready to challenge these things, that is ready to be in solidarity with those who face those forms of persecution. And that's I think the most important question.
Well, at this point, we can say that the innocent people, or poor people, always face persecution, whether they live in the South Asia or wherever they are. So they are always discriminated and targeted on the basis of religion, their religions, caste, and creed. So do you think poverty and socioeconomic vulnerability are the major causes of increasing the sectarian violence, communal conflicts, religion discrimination, and deteriorating law and order? And how can we identify the elements which increase the rate of poverty in the special?
Yes, I mean, I think it's a fundamental question that that movements that are regressive and movements that are racist always play on those divisions. Always try to create a sort of a sense of the other, the enemy, so as to divert attention from the real causes. So that there's a long history, and you could pick any number of examples. I mean, the subcontinent that you live in was shaped and is still influenced enormously by those kinds of communal and sectarian divisions that have been carefully fostered. So challenging that. By challenging the injustices, but also seeking to build movements that unify people is absolutely essential, in my opinion.
It's very difficult, but not impossible to eliminate all these causes. So the important thing is that to identify the element that affect the human rights, and such as increasing the rate of poverty and rate of persecution. So then we can work on their resolution, and which is already a big challenge. So as you know, the poverty affects an individual in a number of the ways and intensifies certain issues of diversity, such as ethnicity, disability, age, gender, and sexual orientation or religion. So the question is how the effect of the poverty can be better understood and addressed.
I mean, I think we live under a social and economic system. However, there may be enormous differences between Canada and Pakistan, Canada and South Asia, but fundamentally, poverty exists precisely because of the way society is organized. And I mean, we live in a society in which most people go to work for an employer, and the level of how they are paid rests very largely on their bargaining power. So if there's a large level of unemployment and a great deal of poverty, that bargaining power is essentially reduced. So, I mean, I would argue we live under a social and economic system that for which poverty is not an accident, but poverty is actually very much part of that system. But the limits of poverty, the extent of poverty, is also shaped by the degree to which people organize and challenge. I mean, in the England of the 1500s, the peasants were driven off of the land, and weakened. If people remain passive in the face of poverty, then they can be as poor as they want. Nothing will be done about it. But to the extent to which people unify, to the extent to which people start to organize and challenge, and there are great models of that. I mean, perhaps in India, the most powerful recent example has been the farmers' movement, where the limits of a regressive agenda were actually challenged and defeated by a mobilization that came from the base in society. And that remains fundamentally true, I think. The question of poverty and how deep it is and whether it exists is not just an academic question. It's a question of struggle. It's a question of a living movement that exists within society. And building that movement is, I think, the decisive question.
Poverty is one of the significant element. We have to understand that measuring poverty is very important. So the elevation of these issues, and then we can work on the development of the society. Development means that there has been some improvement, and improvement must be measurable. So can you tell me how many people are involved in this mission and what socioeconomics and socio-political challenges they face in addition to religious-based discrimination?
Yes. Well, I mean, we certainly, in the period that I have been an organizer, we have certainly never achieved the status of a mass movement. We've mobilized thousands of people, and we've had hundreds of people involved in the work that we do. But I look at the model that existed in the 1930s that I spoke of. There you had a situation where people were organized on the basis they didn't have internet, obviously. They didn't even really have telephones. The basis on which people were organized was block committees. The housing that people lived in, they were organized within that, and they could mobilize very large numbers of people in the space of minutes through the network that they have. We don't have that kind of level of mobilization. I believe the period that's opening up before us may well create those kinds of conditions where the building of such a movement exists. But that has to be the goal. That has to be the goal to mobilize on that scale. And I mean, with regards to poverty itself, I think it's driven by various things, but the scale of poverty in today's situation is so clearly increasing. I look across the internet and I look at the impact of the economic scarring of the pandemic on the poor and oppressed countries of the earth, and the levels of poverty and extreme deprivation are absolutely skyrocketing. But even in rich countries, I just saw an article from Australia. The cost of living crisis is creating a situation where the wages of workers are no longer keeping up, but the people that are forced to live on government income are simply being utterly abandoned. So I think that we're living in a period where all across the world the poverty crisis is exploding. And the need to organize in the face of it is greater than it's ever been. With regards to sort of rich and poor countries, there is no question that if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, you're going to be dealing with an experience of poverty that is massively greater than anything that's being experienced in Canada. But at the same time, the levels of poverty that exist in such a wealthy country as this are in some ways an indictment of the system, right? I mean, for it to have a city where there is so much wealth, and recently the story emerges of a man who froze to death in a bus shelter in Toronto. Now, I mean, that man froze to death within a few feet of the warmth and safety and comfort that he needed. He died in a neighborhood where there are people who are millionaires and multimillionaires. And so that injustice is so profound and so enormous and so stark that I think that is a factor in driving things as well. So yes, a challenge to poverty is, I think this is a time when the challenges of poverty are greater than they've been for a lifetime, but are also the possibilities of challenging poverty are also greater than they've been before.
Yeah, so you are really right. It's really appreciated, and thank you for sharing your thoughts. Since 2019, the COVID-19 pandemic has been making a walk in the world. As a result of pandemic, countless people, particularly minorities and indigenous people, those from the underprivileged communities, have lost their employment and livelihood. So can you briefly tell us about the hardship of the minorities and during enduring pandemic?
Yes, I mean, that's certainly true on a global scale. The pandemic itself, I think, was produced by the way in which society and agriculture is organized. The sort of the destruction of habitat, industrialized farming techniques, the proximity of domestic animals and people to wild animals, all those things generated the pandemic. But then once the pandemic came into existence, I think it followed the fault lines of social and racial inequality that exists within society. Um, so that in Toronto early in the pandemic, uh, over 80% of the people that were sickening with the pandemic were racialized people, which is an indication of some of the inequalities that exist. In terms of people's experience of the pandemic, I read of migrant workers within India who faced the pandemic in a situation where they had no protections and no supports whatsoever. And that's true. That's true in a global way. We come Whether we're coming out of this pandemic is still not clear. The strategy of reopening, vaccinating lots of people in rich countries and hoping that's going to be enough to get us through is a questionable tactic. But if we are in fact emerging from the pandemic, we're not going to be going back to the situation that existed prior to the pandemic. There's too much economic scarring. There's too much crisis within the world. The supply chains have been disrupted. There's going to be considerable difficulties in the period ahead, and it is going to play out and it's going to continue to play out along those fault lines of inequality. There will be generalized hardship for many, many people, but all those people who are persecuted minorities for whatever reason are going to face the consequences to a much sharper degree and much worse than other people. And that's going to continue to be something that we must challenge.
So we can say that the people have had a hard time during the epidemic, whether they belonging to the minorities or the majority. So far in the 2019, the epidemic has been also one of the big reason for the raising the poverty rate. So further, I would like to know what kind of steps have you been taken to protect and support of the right of indigenous and underprivileged communities, and how are you aiding them in their struggle against day-to-day injustice?
Well, I mean, I think there's been a great deal. I mean, I speak of the Toronto experience, the experience right here in this city. There's been a great deal of people organising to challenge those injustices. Early on in the pandemic, the federal government provided some improved programs to meet people's economic needs during the period of lockdown. Those were all removed. As well, huge numbers of poor, disproportionately racialized tenants faced a loss of income that meant that they couldn't pay their rent. So the situation was so extreme that the government was forced to implement a moratorium on evictions from people's housing. But those have all gone now. So people are facing the possibility of loss of housing on an enormous scale. I spoke of a time when we set up a camp of homeless people in a park. That isn't the tactic we would use today because those camps have become normal. Today in Toronto, homeless encampments are everywhere. And it's an expression of how extreme the crisis is becoming, and people are organising in the face of that, and people are challenging it. So it's not like we're starting from nowhere, but there's a need to organise on a much bigger scale, and there's a need to build a unified movement. Too often, I think, questions of persecuted minorities, questions of the poorest people, questions of homeless people are considered to be, yes, that's shocking, that's bad, but it doesn't really speak to our life experience. I think that we have to build a unified movement that defends its gains but leaves no one behind. If people are facing racism or religious persecution, if people are facing social abandonment, that has to be a priority for everyone to challenge. And only if we build that kind of movement can we make a difference. And I can't pretend we've built that movement yet, but we must build it.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts and experience with us. So, is your organization OCAP working for the betterment of socio-economic condition of people, particularly minorities in South Asia?
Well, I acknowledging that I have stepped down as an organizer with OCAP, but during the years I was involved, and it remains true, OCAP, of course, was a poor people's organization based in the city of Toronto. The focus of its work was therefore challenging poverty in the city in which we live and in the province of Ontario that Toronto is part of. Having said that, we've always put a premium on solidarity, and we've always looked to try to place the struggles that we were engaged in an international context. So I can't say that OCAP in Toronto is in a position to offer an enormously important concrete contribution to struggles of people in South Asia, but we try as much as we can to spread an awareness of the fact that our struggle is an international one and to take concrete measures of support. And sometimes we do have opportunities to make very concrete contributions. There was a strike by workers in Sri Lanka on one particular occasion where they put out an appeal for help. And the headquarters of the company that was exploiting these workers and that had sent police in against them was actually based in Toronto. And we organized a solidarity action at the headquarters of that company. And the day after we did it, the workers in Sri Lanka reported that the company began negotiating with them to resolve the strike. So we were actually able to use the quite disgusting fact that this company would consider something happening in Toronto embarrassing, but the violence that they were unleashing against workers in Sri Lanka was of no concern to them. We were able to turn that around and actually use that in a way that was important. So yes, we do see ourselves. We always did see ourselves as part of a movement of international solidarity.
Yeah, it's pretty fine. As we all know, your whole life you are fighting against the injustice, and it's really appreciated. So within the context of global situation, where the collaboration and engagement, mutual assistance are critical for the strengthening the minorities' rights. So how can SARIM and OCAP, or as you individual, potentially collaborate with each other to the benefit of minorities or underprivileged communities?
Yeah, well, I believe that OCAP would, and not just OCAP, within this city of Toronto, there are a whole number of organizations who would be interested in working to build a closer working relationship with you. I think that that there may well be particular concrete ways in which we can support each other. I just gave, for example, the example of the strike of the Sri Lankan workers. There are situations where speaking out can make a real difference. But there's also a question of making people aware. There's also a question of building an understanding. Within Toronto is actually one of the most multicultural cities on earth. It has an enormous immigrant population. It has people who've come from many, many parts of the world, including, of course, Pakistan. And so to deepen those links and connections in important ways, yes, for education, but also for practical support, I think is always entirely possible and something that should always be explored.
Yeah, SARIM is this SARIM supports the promotion of our culture and solidarity. The spirit of sharing the importance for combating the poverty for underprivileged communities. So we will be pleased to collaborate with you, and we would like to join hands together for the rights of the underprivileged communities, and because we know that the unity is essential in the fighting of against the injustice. So thank you so much for your time and consideration. I look forward to seeing you at our upcoming event, like webinar or some panel discussion. So would you like to join us in Pakistan if a similar event are organized in the future?
If that were possible, it would be absolutely wonderful. I'd be very, very happy to accept.
Yeah, we will be happy to welcome you. It will be an honor for us. So finally, and most significant, do you have any advice and message for the minorities and underprivileged communities who are being persecuted across the world, and particularly in South Asia?
Well, I mean, those minorities are engaged in incredible struggles that I can't even begin to imagine. So for me to try to offer advice in one sense is I think hopeless, but in another sense, all I can say is that we must build the greatest possible awareness of each other's struggles. We must build the strongest sense of solidarity that is possible, and we must see all of our struggles as linked to something broader. In the end, we want to live in a world where there are no persecuted minorities. We want to live in a world that is fundamentally just and decent, and that where human beings and the human personality can be developed as they need to be developed. And that can't happen as long as people face persecution and intolerance and marginalization and all of these great evils. So I think we all have a common interest in working together to challenge these things.
Thank you for your valuable words, and hopefully this message will motivate all human beings belonging to any community or any nations to maintain peace and prosperity among all. So now it's time for leaving. It was a tremendous and impressive conversation with you, Mr. John Clarke, and we absolutely appreciate your struggle, hard work, and your dedications. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very, very much. Goodbye.
We'll be back soon with another special guest. Till then, goodbye and stay blessed.